Hey, come see us on tour. We'll be in Duluth, Georgia, Jacksonville, Florida, Los Angeles, Tempe, Arizona, and Burbank, California. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for those tickets. Breaking teacher Enoch Burke arrested at Wilson's Hospital School after refusing to endorse and affirm transgender ideology. Judge Barry O'Donnell, who made almost $400,000 from 2016 to 2018 representing Tulsa as a barrister, ordered his arrest. Tulsa is the Irish State Child Protection Agency, an organization saturated with LGBT ideology, urging staff recently to learn about cross-dressers and drag performers and making acceptance of LGBT and transgender ideology a condition for fostering children. So here's a little bit up in being arrested.
I have a right to work here.
He has a right.
I have a right to be here. And
You're arresting
not
him.
to tell students they need to tell
puberty
blockers.
You're arresting him
Not
because
to
he
tell
won't
students
endorse
that they need to
transgender
take
ideology.
puberty.
Shame upon you, Gordon.
Here at Wilson's Hospital School, Enoch Burke, teacher, being arrested for not accepting transgenderism.
Nor should I. And I'm not going to turn my back on my duty to my students.
I'm not going to turn back on my duty.
No, you don't have a duty to do what's wrong.
No, you never
And
have
to
a
bring me
duty to
before
do
the
what's
court.
Even though
To bring me
there's
before the
abuse
court.
inside those
No,
gates.
to bring me before the
Even though
court.
there's abuse.
This is a
Puberty
disgrace.
blockers.
Children are being
Puberty
taught
blockers.
to tell a young boy.
Suicide.
Surgery.
Yes, surgery, mutilation.
Yes.
Mutilation.
It's a
And
disgrace.
suicide.
An
Mutilation.
absolute disgrace.
Mutilation.
An absolute
You're
disgrace.
telling a
Puberty
boy that he's
blockers.
gender
Do you have
neutral.
a conscience?
Yeah, that he has to take chemicals. That he has to take
He has broken
chemicals.
no law.
That
He
he has
has
to take
broken no
chemicals.
law.
to be heavy-handed.
You know that, Garda.
No, that he has to
He has
take
broken no
chemicals.
law.
I'm not going to be heavy-handed.
He has broken no law. You have no right.
It is the duty.
Shame upon you.
It
So-
is the duty of police officers and people to resist enforcing unjust laws.
I agree.
Enforcing unjust laws is the definition of tyranny.
If you're giving an illegal, immoral, and unconstitutional order in the military, it is your duty to not obey that order. And I know that because of Iran Contra and Oliver North saying, "Well, if the president of the United States told me to sit on my head in the corner, I would do it." That's not what you're supposed to do. You're supposed to only follow constitutional, lawful orders.
And as I think we discussed before when I was on your show, the trans push, which is really anti-gay at its core, and is hiding underneath the gay rights that were attained through decades of hard work, and as gay rights was the civil rights of the 70s, 80s, and 90s. I think we'd all agree to that. So what happens was the trans rights was the trans the lawyers who were working said we have to do this behind undercover, and we need to suppress this so that people don't know, and you need to do this, and this behind the scenes. And it was hidden. If people would know that this was going to be the result, that people would be arrested for opposing the mutilation, and it is mutilation. I mean, for 14-year-olds aren't allowed to vote, drive,
Get a tattoo.
drink.
They're not allowed to get a tattoo.
I mean, so why would they be allowed to mutilate themselves and later and become infertile as well with these repurposed castration drugs, which is what puberty blockers are, repurposed castration drugs. I mean, Avis, and you can't rent a car in the United States unless you're 25 years old. I mean, what does Enterprise, Avis, Hertz know that the medical establishment seems to be so blind to? These are children. They're not allowed to make these decisions, and the parents are also not allowed to make those decisions for them. And you have what has happened is you have an abuse of the system, that they went around and they got to the trans lawyers that they used, got to the legislatures, they got to whether it's school boards, and they were able to manipulate and then change things behind the scenes. And they went out of their way to do this silently and to do it below public scrutiny so that they could pass these things. And this is the end result. And I think people are turning on it. But you really have a pincers act, or at the same time you have this kind of strange leftist thing happening. At the same time, you're having a contraction on freedom of speech. And really, now England is lost. You have people now that they care less about the citizens than they care more about these people who hate their country. And I'm talking about these fundamentalist Islamics who have no love lost between their new country and themselves. They want to destroy it. They want to break it down, tear it down. And that is a real threat to Western civilization. And as you know, our friend Douglas Murray said, it seems like the Western world is committing suicide.
Well, I don't know. I agree with Douglas Murray on certain things, and I vehemently disagree with him on others. But I do know, and I don't really know enough about what's happening in the UK, but I do know, I have noticed that they are flooding the Western world with immigrants, right? And that can't be, just like we covered in the last segment where they had their January 6th in Brazil to get rid of Bolsonaro. They had the January 6th here to get rid of Trump. The exact same playbook that the CIA is using.
What replaced it was worse. I mean, when you think about Bolsonaro, what replacing it was this leftist authoritarian.
It's exactly.
So, I mean, the same thing with the Arab uprising. It accomplished nothing except that it just forced an even tighter crushing of personal liberties in those countries. And I think that has to go back. Well, that specifically goes back to our foreign policy in the United States, was it's just to replace anything secular, which ends up with a fundamentalist Islamic regime. I mean, if you take a look at Saddam Hussein, for better or worse, he was our guy against the buttress to Iran. As soon as you get rid of him, you get these Islamic fundamentalists again. I mean, whether it's Nasser in Egypt, it just keeps happening. Even the PLO. I mean, what is replacing it is even worse. So it's the United States making things worse. As far as what's happening in Europe, is you have immigrant waves of people that have no interest at all in becoming part of that society, and in fact hate that society and want that society, its structures, to fall. And you cannot have, I mean, at what point is the tipping point where you're bringing people into your culture that hate you, that hate your culture, and that have no plans at all of assimilating? At what point does your culture tip? And you're seeing a tipping point now in England. I believe you're seeing a tipping point, and you're seeing the reflective nature of tolerance, which is just to smash anyone who disagrees with it, like what you're seeing with that teacher getting arrested for just common sense stuff that you would have been hard for anyone to have disagreed with it 10 years ago. The fact that, you shouldn't transition boys and mutilate them surgically, or girls surgically, and give them fertility blockers, which could make them infertile for the rest of their life. I mean, these things now, that I think that's the point, and that's what Douglas Murray, I do agree with, that there seems to be this, and James Lindsay talks about this, there does seem to be this push to cause such an uproar and to cause so much conflict and disagreement with everybody, that what we'll do to exchange some semblance of peace, we're willing to give up our liberties. And that seems to be not such an outlandish theory at this point.
Well, I do not understand what the billionaires who run things, it's certainly nefarious why they want to flood the Western world with immigration. Like, I've always been pro-immigration my entire life. I've always been, and I still am, but you can't have illegal immigration. You can't have Well, for instance, what we did to Libya. So I found out that Gaddafi always thought that he was safe because he was going to be the wall of immigrants from Africa into Western Europe, and he would stop them. Well, they got rid of him, and one of the reasons why, because they didn't want to stop them anymore. They wanted it to happen. And everybody. I'm slow to wake up to this because I don't know much about Europe like I should, but I see it now in my own country, and it doesn't make any sense to me why there's the one idea to suppress wages. That's obviously a thing that why they do that. Bernie Sanders used to talk about that up until 2016. He talked about how that was a Koch brothers idea to keep open borders. And so I see it in the same things happening in Western Europe, and there's a blowback to it now, right? And Poland, by the way, they have tightened down their borders, and they're not letting that happen. But it is there's got to be a nefarious purpose for it.
I'm sure. Well, for part of that is, the Middle East and Afghanistan had run its course. And so I remember talking to a retired colonel a few years ago, and he said, well, yeah, we're gearing up for North Africa because that's going to be the next hotspot. So, I mean, there is money to be gained, as you know, and I know, there's money to be gained by starting new wars in new places, in places that are that you can disrupt, and you can disrupt it. And unfortunately, the United States has been very, very keen to disrupt places, and they're very good at it. So, I mean, there's money in it. How much money? There's more bloodshed. I mean, do we need to be in 134 different bases around the world?
No, we're in over 800.
800 bases?
800 military bases. Yes.
What is 134? Is that the countries that we're in? I find that hard to believe.
That must be the countries.
Okay, so these, I mean, the fact that we have a base in Syria is outrageous.
Permanent.
I mean, it's unbelievable. So the idea that that somehow is necessary and that the American public seems to be okay with that is outrageous. And I would hope that the disruption of a Trump, the potential disruption of a Trump presidency is worth the risk. Because what it could do is it potentially could put a stopgap. I mean, I don't necessarily know if he puts Jamie Dimon as the head of the Treasury, things are going to continue to move in the direction it is. However, I do think as far as foreign policy, as far as the Ukraine war, as far as an interesting, I never thought, I mean, since the last time we talked, which was maybe a year ago on your show, we were talking about something that you and I would be shocked if any presidential candidate of either party would discuss it, which was the health of the American public, specifically the health of children. And the fact that President Trump is talking about that, whether he follows through, I don't know. I'm hopeful. So is Robert Kennedy, our friend. However, the fact that it's being talked about and that people were applauding it as something we need to do, because we do need to do this. I mean, as I'm sure you've heard, we spend 17.5% of our GDP, 17.5% on health. It's 5 times more than they do in Europe, and we're not getting the results, good results for it. We are funneling all our treasure into the military industrial complex and the pharmaceutical industrial complex, and they are fleecing this country. And I talk about this. I said, forget about the cartels, the Mexican drug cartels, which gets all the publicity. It's a measly $10 billion to $15 billion a year, whereas the legal drug cartels is $300 billion, and they want to ramp that up to $700 billion by the end of this decade. So forget about it. I mean, forget about the Democrat, Republican, forget about anything. If we don't get this nation healthy, we're not going to be able to afford Medicare. We're not going to be able to afford roads or anything. We're going to be like Italy. There's going to be enclaves here. We're going to have, our money's going to be the lira, and we're going to have have armed guards, and there's going to be 90% poor people. And then you're going to have what's downtown Los Angeles is going to be America. And that's what they want. And that's why the Democratic Party, it's very important, whether you're a Democrat or Republican, to want a normal, functional Democratic Party. And the only way to do that is to kick them out of power this time. And I'm hopeful that people will see this for what it is. It's an authoritarian power grab. And we need to do everything in our power to get rid of it. And I'm sorry that Robert Kennedy, which shows how captured our media is they can just ignore him. Before they tried to stomp him out, when he's on your show and they're saying all these shitty things about him, the way to really kill somebody is to just silence them, not give them any print. And that's what they did.
Well, here is, what was encouraging to me was when Bobby Kennedy gave that speech at that Trump rally. Yeah. And people say to me, well, do you really think Trump is going to do that? And I've made that case myself. Hey, the first time, Trump said he was going to drain the swamp, and he ended up, he found his cabinet at the bottom when he drained the swamp, right? And, And so he didn't do those things he said he was going to do. So what makes you think I said that to Alex Jones when I had him on my show a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
I go, what makes you think he's going to, and Alex Jones, he says, well, I have to help him get elected so that I can hold his feet to the fire. And I'm like, well, what's encouraging to me is when Bobby gave that speech at that Trump rally, wasn't that I thought Trump would or wouldn't follow through on those words. At least they're giving lip service to it. But the important thing was there was a stadium full of Republican voters who were cheering those things on, which means that we have way more in common than the media wants us to believe. The establishment wants us to think that Republican voters are your enemy and that they're all white supremacists and they hate America and they're Nazis and they're not, right? They're just, it turns out we all want the same things.
We do. And it turns out that the Republican National Convention in Milwaukee didn't need to board up their windows, whereas in Chicago, the Democrat National Convention did.
I covered that.
Turns out the people who yell and the people who scream and the people who shout other people down, they're not conservatives. They're these closed-minded liberals who, if anything's fascistic, then it's that. If anything is authoritarian, it's that. If anything, what Kamala Harris has exposed herself, and that they found that Jack Taper thing that's going all over the internet today about how the privilege of free speech, he's lost Elon Musk losing his privilege for free speech.
I played that before I brought you on. I played that with Matt Taibbi. Yeah.
And Matt Taibbi, by the way, that was the chance for the Democrats to regroup and go, you know what, we pushed too far. Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberg, when they came to Congress, and thankfully the Republicans have a little bit of a lead there so they can actually hold hearings on something so consequential as a government violating Americans' First Amendment rights. And instead of regrouping and saying, okay, we made a mistake, let's get to the bottom of it and make sure it doesn't happen again, they attacked Matt Taibbi and Michael Schellenberg, and they instead of just regrouping and correcting, and that's a problem.
So I'll say one thing. I like protests, right? So I was there. I covered the protests in Chicago, and what bothered me was there was no protests inside the convention center, right? Because the last time I went to the Democratic convention in 2016, half the party had voted for Bernie Sanders. In the primary, half the votes were for overthrowing the the corruption of the Democratic Party. And this time, and so there was lots of protests inside the convention, outside the convention. I like a raucous convention, right?
Absolutely. Well, that's democracy's messy.
Yeah.
You don't get smooth from smooth, you get it from friction.
Right.
And so what happened there was talk about 3 coups in a row. The first one was to throw Bernie aside. The second one was the Democratic Party wants to choose. They want to give you the illusion of choice, just like they want to give you the illusion of diversity. They want diversity of ideas. They want diversity of skin color. They want it to look different, but the same ideas, the same ideology. And so when it came to supposedly having a different choice, whether it was Tulsi Gabbard, Kamala Harris, Pete Buttigieg, or Biden, and Biden not winning that first primary, they all quit. Which is interesting because that was and then they basically said Democratic Party all get behind one guy because that was their chance to beat Trump, they figured. But it took away the choice for the people. Yeah. And Macron used that same idea to get everybody to back off in the last election to regain power in France. So what you really have is you don't have democracy. You have a way of gaming the system and usurping democracy and eliminating people's choice, just like they just discounted the 14 million voters in the primaries for Biden. They just said, no, we're going with Kamala. So that's 3 coups in a row. At what point does the Democratic voter go, enough? And I think, as a former Democrat most of my life, I said enough.
I'm going to be like Russell Dobler. I'm going to be writing in Dave Chappelle again this year. Hey, come see us on tour. We'll be in Duluth, Georgia, Jacksonville, Florida, Los Angeles, Tempe, Arizona, and Burbank, California. Go to jimmydore.com for a link for those tickets.